Well, good morning, Highland Oaks. It's great to be with you this morning. I think this is the fourth or fifth year that Pat and I have been able to not really swap pulpits. You still have yours here, just swap preachers. We took last year off. I had something else that was on my calendar. I couldn't do it, and I missed being here. And so thank you for welcoming me back. I think I first preached here at this church over 10 years ago. And during the time when you didn't have a preacher, I preached here some, and then I preached here almost every year in the last 5 or 6 years. So it's always good to be able to come back and see familiar faces. This is one of those weird Sundays. It doesn't happen every year, but let me fix my pant. That's going to bug me. It may not bug you, but it's going to bug me. It's one of those weird Sundays where, because November has 5 Sundays, we're not quite ready to do Christmas or Advent yet. Not yet. I mean, we're tired of being thankful, but tired of eating thankfully, but it's not quite that time yet. We're caught in between the seasons of Thanksgiving and Christmas and Advent leading up to it. And I wonder if that's not a good place to be this morning as we talk about what it means to be a disciple who gives generously. Because in some ways, Christmas is about receiving this wonderful gift from God, and Thanksgiving is about saying thank you to God for all the gifts He's already given us. And somewhere in there is a message for those of us who wonder, what does it mean to be generous? Probably one of the most helpful books I've read in the last 10 years is Jonathan Haidt's The Happiness Hypothesis. Some of you are probably familiar with Haidt's work. He's written more recent books like The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. Both of those are fine books, but I really love The Happiness Hypothesis. Because what Haidt does in that book is he's a social scientist. He combines contemporary scientific research with ancient wisdom and asks the question, what does it mean to pursue happiness? And is there even an equation that we could come up with to somehow define how to best pursue happiness? And one of the things he says in that book is that one of the reasons the pursuit of happiness, lasting happiness, can be so frustrating for so many of us, and why happiness, when we do experience it, can then be so elusive immediately after that experience, is because of the way our brain works. Our brain has the ability to quickly adapt to new circumstances and outside stimuli. So, say you experience something that makes you happy in the moment. Your circumstances change. Things are going to be good for you now. You're happy about it. And your brain has the ability to very quickly then adapt to what made you happy so that it becomes a new normal. So what once made you happy doesn't make you as happy as it once did. This happens every time Apple releases a new iPhone. Really, just a couple of years before, you purchased a brand new iPhone that made you happy. Made you look taller. You lost weight. It changed your life. And it lasted for a month, a week, a couple of days, and then your brain adapted, and what made you happy is now the new normal. It's just the way it works. Haidt points to some research in his book about how both lottery winners and those who experience a traumatic injury that leaves them paralyzed, how after a year of whether you win the lottery or you experience a traumatic injury, after a year, your happiness levels reset to what would be called a baseline happiness. In other words, you go back to being about as happy as you were before either winning the lottery, that's a positive experience, makes you feel really good, or suffering a traumatic injury that obviously would depress you and make you feel terrible and leave you disappointed. After about a year, your wonderful brain resets, and that's what Haidt calls it the happiness reset. It resets to a baseline level of happiness, whether something really good or really terrible happened to you. Our brain reloads and resets when it comes to happiness. Here's the way Don Draper said it. But can I get up there? I don't see it there. Not up there. Okay. So let's go back. That's not Don Draper. There's Don. What is happiness? It's a moment before you need more happiness. That's why happiness, lasting happiness, is so elusive. What Haidt ends up arguing in his book is that when we actively pursue happiness, we think that making more money or buying more stuff or even getting more people to like us, we think that will make us happy. It never works that way. Happiness is not something you actively pursue. He says happiness actually tends to come in the side door of your life when you're least expecting it. Now, Haidt's work in the happiness hypothesis pairs nicely with what Emily Smith wrote several years ago in an article in The Atlantic, where she makes a distinction between living a happy life and a meaningful life. And this is the way she frames the distinction. It says, happiness without meaning characterizes a relatively shallow, self-absorbed, or even selfish life in which things go well, needs and desires are easily satisfied, and difficult or taxing entanglements are avoided. That's how to be happy, she says. But that kind of happy life, which is shallow and selfish, really boils down to living an uncomplicated life where we withdraw from difficult circumstances and situations, avoid people who would add drama to our lives, people in their pain, in their difficulty, people who are in need, so that we are protecting ourselves against anything that might spoil our isolated happiness. And so the secret to being happy, Smith says, is you just have to avoid anybody who would come into your life and complicate it and make you unhappy, or avoid anyone who's already unhappy. And she compares that to a meaningful life, which she characterizes as investing your life in others. Opening yourself up to their pain and their suffering, their drama, their problems. Opening yourself up to all kinds of unhappy situations. And one of the examples she gives in her article is the well-known and still inspirational story of Viktor Frankl, who survived life in a Nazi concentration camp during the Holocaust and then went on to write the classic book, Man's Search for Meaning. Most of us know his story, but what is lesser known are some of the details that led to him ending up in a concentration camp in the first place. Because in 1941, he was a prominent psychiatrist and neurologist at the Rothschild Hospital in Vienna. His career was on the rise, the threat of the Nazis were looming, and he applied for a visa to America, and it was granted to him. And he and his new wife had the ability to flee the Nazis, leave Europe, and come to America, where he would not only be safe and secure, but he could also continue to pursue his blooming career. But at the time, the Nazis were already in Vienna, and they were beginning to round up Jews and take them to concentration camps, and they were starting with the elderly. And Frankl knew that it would only be a matter of time before the Nazis came for his elderly parents. And so he found himself facing a horrible dilemma. Should he stay in Vienna and stay with his parents and help them become accustomed to life in a camp, to help them manage that transition, or should he take his wife and flee to America? One night he went for a walk to clear his head, and he ended up at a local cathedral, and he entered and he listened to the organ music as it was playing, and he began to pray, and he asked what he called for, a hint from heaven. He said, what do I do? Do I stay here and take care of my parents, or do I leave them to their fate? He walked home and he found the answer on the table. His father had brought home a chunk of marble from a local synagogue that the Nazis had already destroyed. And on this chunk of marble was a fragment of one of the 10 commandments. And it was the 4th commandment, the one about honor your father and mother. And he knew what he had to do. And so he stayed in Vienna. And he served his parents and then other prisoners in the concentration camp. And he, nor anyone else, would ever argue that his experience of serving others in Nazi concentration camps, that was a happy experience. It did not make him happy. But those experiences were profoundly meaningful. Not just for him, but all of us who have learned from him. So Smith, she closes her article in The Atlantic with this conclusion. After all kinds of citing scientific research and philosophical reflection, she says, here's what it boils down to. If you want to live a happy life in the shallow, selfish sense of the word, be a taker. And that includes taking yourself out of any difficult circumstances that could ruin your happiness. She said, if you want to live a meaningful life, be a giver. Give over your life to the needs of others. Give up yourself for the sake of others. Now, she wrote this as if it were some new finding. Breakthrough scientific research. Newfangled philosophical reflection. Yet 2,000 years ago, Jesus had already taught us this. It's one of his most famous sayings. We all know it, and yet, think about it, it almost didn't make it into the Bible. Because you don't find this teaching from Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 Gospels that tell the story of his life, death, and resurrection, and include almost all of his teachings. So this teaching doesn't show up in the Gospels. This teaching made it in the Bible when the Apostle Paul quoted it in one of his sermons, and Luke wrote it down in the book of Acts. It's the only place we find it, Acts chapter 20, verse 35. Paul is speaking. He says, in everything I did, I showed you, by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak, remembering the words the Lord Jesus himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Jesus taught it's better to be a giver than a receiver. Now, that doesn't mean one is wrong, one is bad, and the other is right and good. They're both good. And they're both necessary because you do not have anything to give unless you first receive. We're caught in between the moments now. We've been saying thank you because thank you is what you say when you receive a gift. But at some point, thank you turns into you're welcome after you have given away some and sometimes all of what you have received. In his book, Falling Upward, Richard Rohr talks about how we live 2 lives, or our life can be broken into 2 halves. I know some of you have studied that book here in classes. It says in the first half of life, it's pretty much about getting, receiving, even taking. We build our lives in the first half of life. We build a platform. We establish our identity. We become who we are. We have a life. And this is good, and it's necessary. Otherwise, how can we let go of our lives, as Jesus teaches us to, unless we first have a life to let go of? So you got to build your life. You got to receive. At times you do have to take. But that's just the first half of life. And the second half of life, which doesn't have that much to do with age, it's more about spiritual and emotional maturity. In the second half of life, we transition from receiving to giving, and we begin to give away. We've established our identity, we've built our life, now we begin to give away all these resources, both in wisdom and materially. We begin to give away these resources we've accumulated. We begin to invest them in other people. And that's a second half of life kind of activity. And we see this play out every year. We'll see it play out in exactly 1 month, either on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, when families get together and gather around a tree and open up presents. And they're gathered around the same tree. There will be two very different experiences of Christmas happening in the same place. Because for the kids, our children, in the first half of life, for them, Christmas is all about getting. It's about receiving. I realized several years ago, my boys, they don't make wish lists. They submit order forms. Just, here you go, Dad. It's what I want. So when you're a kid, being happy is getting everything you want at Christmas with a few surprises thrown in. But at the same time, around the same tree, there will be a different experience for the parents, for the adults in the second half of life. Because once you have kids or grandkids, you know this is not about what I get, it's what I give. And in the second half of life, when we're giving, we realize true joy is enjoying watching someone else enjoy what they're getting. I've watched the classic movie, A Christmas Story, hundreds of times in one day. It's the story of little Ralphie who wants his Red Ryder BB gun. And for years I watched that movie and I thought, oh, the best scene in the movie is when little Ralphie gets his BB gun. Hate to spoil it for those of you who haven't seen it. Little Ralphie, at the end, he finally gets his BB gun, and I would watch that as a little kid or a teenager, thinking, that is so good. I love that scene. And then I became a parent, and I realized that's not the best scene in the movie. It's the second best scene. The best scene in the movie is when it cuts to his father's face. And you see the look on his father's face as he's watching little Ralphie open his present and realize he's going to get his BB gun. Why? Because it really is better to give than to receive. And this is the deep wisdom embedded in the gospel. And the deeper we sink into the gospel story, the more meaningful our experiences as Christ followers become, because at the heart of the gospel story is a giver who gave us the most precious gift imaginable. John 3:16, another famous verse. For God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son. And it's when God gives himself away in Christ that the gospel sets off this chain reaction throughout creation, and it inspires us to give ourselves away. It's one of my biggest problems I have with TV preachers and the way they ask for money. You know, those guys on TBN, the Big Hair Network, when they're asking. Because how do they frame it? It's always framed in terms, you need to give so you can get more. You need to give so you can receive. That's not the gospel order. The gospel order is always God gives first, and God gives abundantly, and then we give out of the abundance that we have already received. We say thank you, but then we turn a thank you into you're welcome, and we give it away. This is the secret, one of the secrets to living a meaningful life. And it just so happens that when happiness does sneak in, it comes in through the side door of generosity. It's what Mary Brenner learned. Mary Brenner was a blonde socialite from Beverly Hills. She was twice divorced, not particularly happy or fulfilled in her life, but in her mid-40s, the gospel changed her life, and a dream was birthed in her, a passion for caring for the poor, the ignored, the forgotten. And with her children grown and out of the house, Mary Brenner felt called to serve in the notorious La Mesa prison in Tijuana, Mexico. She served the forgotten prisoners there. We have an image of Mary. She felt called to serve those prisoners. This blonde socialite from Beverly Hills walked among thieves and drug dealers and murderers, touching cheeks, offering prayers. She handed out extra supplies. She arranged for medical care. She attended funerals. And even the most hardened criminals at the La Mesa prison referred to her as Mama. In 2008, she had been away from the prison getting supplies, and she came back to find that there had been a riot, or it was in the midst of a riot. The electricity had been cut off. Soldiers were surrounding the prison, trying to quell the violence. Some of the prisoners inside had taken hostages and started fires. One witness said there were bullets flying everywhere. And Mary Brenner stepped up and pleaded with the authorities to let her go into the prison. They said no, but she persisted, and finally they allowed her to go in. And she walked into this dark prison and was met by an inmate named Blackie. And she fell on her knees in front of Blackie, and she pleaded with him to stop the riot. And Blackie said to her, "Oh, Mama, when we heard your voice, we dropped our guns out the window." How could Mary Brenner, this blonde socialite from Beverly Hills, how could Mary Brenner have that much power, that much credibility with those hardened prisoners? Well, she did more than just serve them. She gave her life to them. She lived among them. For 30 years, she lived in a cell in the La Mesa prison, in the section of the prison where the female inmates were housed. She lived there. And when she died several years ago, news of her death, she was 86 years old, news of her death was widely reported. It was Mary Brenner, who came to be known as Mama Antonia, was not a taker. She was a giver. And her life was full. The second half of her life was full of meaning. After he survived the Holocaust, Viktor Frankl wrote these words in Man's Search for Meaning. He said, "Being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself. Be it a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter, the more one forgets himself or herself by giving himself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human he is." What is the gospel? The gospel is the story of God becoming human. The incarnation, God becoming one of us, becoming a human being, not just to die on the cross and save us from our sins so that we go to heaven when we die, but also to show us how to be truly human before we die. To show us how to live a meaningful life that transcends our shallow definitions of happiness. To show us, not just tell us, but to show us, by giving up his life as a ransom for many, that it really is better to give than to receive. So it's right, it's good, it's essential to say thank you and be grateful for all the blessings we've been given. But it's better to be able to say you're welcome to someone after we've given what we have away. May we all have the opportunity to say both thank you and you're welcome as we follow the best giver who's ever lived, died, and was raised from the dead.